audience that attends every Wednesday online. Thank you to you faithful ones who come every Wednesday and every Sunday morning when we go through this. We are at a place where sometimes I get overlapped because, I'm teaching on one on Sunday and one on another one on Monday, and I forget if you are ahead or behind or. So where are you right now? You should be in the Song of Solomon somewhere, maybe?
Psalms.
The Psalms and the song, maybe the poetry section. Is that where you're?
Where are we?
I went to the Sunday before.
Anyway, I thought that I would take just a little bit of time to review the
Yeah, we're in Psalms and Romans.
Psalms and Romans. Okay.
Psalms 75 through 86 I just finished yesterday.
Good. Well, then this will give you a little bit of a head start if I move you to where you're going to be this week and talk to you some about what you can anticipate. Sometimes it'll make it easier to appreciate, The first thing is, of course, when you think of the poetry section in the Bible, you really begin with the book of Job, and it enters into a different genre or a different kind of writing. So we call this poetry, even though poetry in Job has two parts. It has a narrative, which of course is true, and that narrative is that Job suffers. And so out of that, there are four different philosophizers who begin to try to interpret why bad things happen to good people. And they begin to go back and forth and share their thoughts. Those four different philosophizers, including Job himself, we'll put Job up at the top because he's trying to figure out what's going on, are Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, and later Elihu. Elihu is the youngest one. He gets no notice for his contributions, but actually for his abilities. He really seemed to have a pretty good grasp of saying, I don't know, and we don't know. We need to be careful because to accuse Job of doing something wrong is not exactly the way to go.
But that is what they did.
That's right. Now, of these, Zophar was the one who was the more critical of the one. He was the one who was the harsher. He had less patience. If you look at the narratives, there is a pattern. Eliphaz usually spoke from tradition, that is, meaning he talked about the things that he had observed. He talked about the things that he had seen in his life, and he talked about sort of like why he felt it was this way, so he used his experience. Bildad was a little bit more of a person who used his observation and thoughts. He was a little bit more thoughtful. He had a little bit better. Zophar was one who was a little bit mean-spirited. And so when you read through, you find that Zophar didn't speak as much, and they go back and forth, and they never get anywhere. Of course, this is where the whole intention of the book of Job is because we don't really get anywhere when we try to figure out what God is doing, because we don't know what God is doing. There are times when his purposes are beyond our standing out, isn't there? So this is, Job starts out as a narrative, that is a truth, but then it turns into a philosophical debate about suffering. We call this whole idea theonomy, T-H-E-O, which means God, and nemi, which has to do with the things that God allows in our life that are evil. How does God allow evil? How does God allow theodicy? Theonomy, theodicy, I-D-I-C-Y is another word. T-H-E-O-N-O-M-Y, which has to do with his law, but theodicy is the one that has to do with suffering specifically and how people relate to it. So most people Most people wonder how God is governing the world, and they wonder why He allows to have sin and things to enter into our life to cause us trouble. Now, everybody knows that in the first part of Job, there was a heavenly scene that the devil came up before God and talked to him. You remember that, do you not? It seems that there was a time when God allowed entry of His angelic being so that He could require of them some accountability. At the time, He allowed Lucifer, who is the evil devil, to come before Him and to give an account. Now, later on in Luke chapter 17, the Bible says Jesus said, I beheld Satan when he fell from heaven, or when he was cast from heaven. There was a point in which Satan was no longer granted entry into the presence of God at all. And it seemed that it happened during the time of Jesus' ministry. I personally think that it did. But Satan still accuses the brothers. That's his primary intention, is to trip up people, to bother people, to plague people. But he still has to get permission from God in order to touch any of God's people. Isn't that a blessing? I pray God won't let him have permission to touch me for a while. And that God would heal me of my hip. Don't you all?
Yes.
Hope that those kind of things that's going on with you, God will just take them away. So Job is a simpler book, and it's the first of the poetic books. The second one is the book of Psalms. And the book of Psalms is a complicated book only because it carries a lot of content of different kinds. In the book of Psalms, you will note, first of all, something that is very obvious. It is divided into 5 books. If you have not noticed this, it's because you really haven't been paying attention. You're reading too fast. But at the end of certain chapters, it will say, the end of book 1. Have any of you all found that? All right, so the end of book 2. So there are 5 books in the book of Psalms. Now, these are just divisions, but there are some things about the endings of those books that are good. They typically end with praise. They end with a high view of God and exaltation of God, etc. Inside of these books, you will find different kinds of content. For example, much of the songwriting of the Hebrews was one of praise. They really did feel that part of their responsibility was to give praise to the things that God was doing. So they thanked God for such things as their history. They thanked God for things such as their past. They thanked God for the present. They thanked God for the future. They thanked God for achievements and blessings. All of these things are going to be some of the things you find inside the Psalms. But not only did they do that, they also had what we call the whiny songs. And there's some of them that became songs where they wanted others to be punished. These were not good songs. So the name of them is IMPRECATORY, imprecatory. To imprecate is to put a desire of suffering upon somebody. You are calling upon suffering because of what people have done. There are several books that are imprecatory. I think probably the You know, there are many of them. I'm trying to think of where it would be. Psalm 139. If you look at the last part of Psalm 139, you'll find that they were really ready for God to kill the Babylonians, and they just asked him to do it. But there are a lot of those in the Bible. Now, the reason why they're in there is because this is a part of our life. Sometimes we don't say it, but we just wish God would take care of the bad guys, you know? Now, we don't sing that much in here. We used to sing a song in the Free Baptist Church that was kind of fun to sing. The song goes, Jesus is coming soon, morning or night. Y'all ever remember that? Here's the part, here's the line. Many will meet their doom, trumpets will sound. It's kind of like, many will meet their doom, trumpets will sound. You know, you're just thinking about people singing that joyfully. Many will meet their doom. Yes. So there's a little bit of that imprecatory nature in some of the songs that we sing. But the psalmist had that. But primarily, these were songs of praise, songs of worship. They were prayers. They were earnest prayers and expressions of some of the deep longings of your heart. There were the question ones, the ones that had to do with, like, why does God allow some people to suffer? There were the ones that were messianic, the ones that told the story of Jesus. Good prime examples of that would be Psalm 22, which when you read that, you have the inner thoughts and the inner feelings of Jesus. You have psalms that invoke protection, like Psalm 91, prayers of protection. You have the story of the poems of historical events, like, for example, Psalm 45 is the story of Solomon's marriage. So you get a little bit of extra stuff in here about history. So Psalms is a fantastic book. And the best part about it is you get to pull these things that are in the book of Psalms so easily and turn them into prayers. It's if you look at the little handbook thing that I've been working on to get to you, one of the hopes is that you've seen how many verses there are to come from Psalms, mostly because the Psalms are so personal. They allow you to give expression to your own feeling. Does this make sense to y'all? Is it boring? You get it? So I would use Psalms after you finish everything and you get done. Use one of the ways that most people read Psalms after they get a good familiar reading of the whole Bible, like within 100 days or whatever, they will go back and they will study the Bible in the following way. And this is a more reasonable way to do it. They will spend 15 minutes a day reading Bible. Well, you can read through the Bible in 1 year, okay? Just if you read 15 minutes a day. If you read one psalm along with that a day, every day, 30 days, you'll read through the Psalms once a month. And it takes somewhere about 5 minutes to do this. So between 15 minutes a day, you can read through the whole Bible. And if you just add one psalm to it, you can read through the Bible, you can read through the Psalms 5 times in a year. And that helps you to be able to pray. And a lot of people will take the psalm, instead of reading it, they will pray it. You know, blessed is the man who trusts in who doesn't trust in the ungodly or walk in the way of the ungodly. You know, blessed is the person whose path is set by the Lord, and that kind of thing. Lord, help my path to be set by the Lord, turning it into prayer. And that's a good way to build up your devotional life. When you finish the book of Psalms, you come to immediately David's son, whose name was Solomon, who wrote Ecclesiastes. And I play about Ecclesiastes, but it's actually a brilliant book. It is a philosophical, it's a philosophical musing, meaning that philosophical musing. Now what I mean by that is that Solomon is trying to figure out some things in the world by observation. He's practicing scientific method. He's looking around, and what he sees troubles him. So he writes about the things that bother him. He sees things out of order. He sees things that aren't working like they're supposed to be. He notices in the world that there are people who are being oppressed. He does not understand the government, why it's not doing more to protect people. And so you just get through the book and you think, wow, things are really messed up, but it's mostly because he's just thinking about stuff that's just not right, or things that are mysterious to him. For example, I'm going to show you just one. There are two times that Solomon gave a couple of good examples of things that bothered him. One, it bothered him when people procrastinated. You know, you just put stuff off. So he wrote in the book of Proverbs, he wrote, so I was wandering by this house, and I saw that there were weeds everywhere grown up, that the garden was all grown over, and I started thinking, a little slumber, you know, let me have a little bit of sleep, a little folding of the hands, just a little rest. And before you know it, everything is kind of taken over. I mean, really, doesn't take long, he says. You just get behind, and things like, they just get messed up. Stay. Good morning. How y'all doing?
Good. How are
You got some rugs?
Yes, sir.
Do you know where to go?
No, sir. I was trying to find somebody.
All right, come with me. Take care of you. Yeah.
Good. How are you?
Music room?
They're supposed to call.
She's not here. One goes in here. I'll get Justin.
So they're gonna put roses?
I think you got two or one?
We got two.
Got two.
This is the small one, I think, was for the ladies' office.
Yeah, maybe. Let me get Justin to come back here.
Is that one?
Hey, Justin.
He's gone. He's on the way.
Okay, we need rugs. Somebody help him put the rugs in.
Where'd the rugs go?
We have some in the music room because of the acoustics.
Oh.
We just have a flat area rug.
Instead of just leaving it.
Yeah.
I was thinking, please not fellowship hall.
No.
You
No,
need
it's
something, you need something in the fellowship hall.
Yeah, it does.
Man.
It does cut down some of the
Need something beside rugs on the ceiling or the walls.
or something.
The thing is, because we have things in there where you eat though,
But it makes sounds too, or you make it to go in the ceiling and all.
Yeah, they have baffles, they call them. And,
Put 'em up.
well, anyway, so the thing that Ecclesiastes, that Solomon looked at, was he saw things that weren't right, and he was troubled by them, and he wrote his book about them. And mostly, he said, you won't ever be able to get everything right in this world. You'll never be able to get everything fixed. And the best thing for you to do is to serve the Lord and do the best you can. Seriously, that's the way the book of Ecclesiastes is. Now, the book of Proverbs, on the other hand, is a book that was written with him along with two others. Agur is one of them, and somebody at the end whose name starts with an S. I don't have my Bible. But anyway, these two people have to contribute their collections of old sayings. And these old sayings have proven to be good things that help people to learn wisdom. Now, all of these are not exactly dependable. So I want to talk about how you interpret the book of Proverbs and how you have to be careful with the book of Proverbs. You know, I've had people who have so many times pulled out stuff from the book of Proverbs and tried to use it as a proof verse that something needs to happen or something needs to be done or whatever. But you find in some of these Proverbs that one of them will be written, and the very next verse says the exact opposite, which tells you that the purpose of Proverbs is not intended to give you like a perfect path. It's intended to make you think about what you're doing. Let's see if I can find a couple of them. It says, whoever walks with the wise becomes wise, but the companion of fools will suffer harm. All right, sounds reasonable enough. Good sense wins favor. The mouth of a fool comes a rod. By the mouth of a fool comes a rod for the back, but the lips of the wise will preserve them. Where there are no oxen, the manger is clean. The abundant comes by the strength of the ox. All right, just a quick little note. There is a certain intentional melody and rhythm that goes along with these proverbs that makes them easy to read and remember. And so when Solomon collected them, he put them down because he wanted people to be able to live by these axioms like we do when we say things like, well, every tub will sit on its own bottom. You know, it's just kind of a reasonable thing. Everybody's going to have to eventually answer for themselves and settle on things themselves. I've always thought that reading through the book of Proverbs was very difficult, mostly because you're going from so many subjects to so many subjects that it's not an easy thing to read. It's a little bit ADD. So there have been times when I took my time and I would read, if I would find a verse on anger, and it does have plenty, like in Proverbs 16. Then I would do like that little number where they put E or A, where it would show across a reference verse to say like Proverbs 17, 11 or whatever. And then I would go and read what it said about anger in other places. So that way I read the book of Proverbs, reading it through, but not right down the line. And it seemed like that for me, that there were a lot of times I got more out of it that way. When my children were young, this was one of the things that I had them to do often, was to read the book of Proverbs. Whenever they did things that they ought not to have done, I would have them to go study Proverbs and to learn some of the things about wisdom. On the end part of the book, let me show you, if you go to the end of Proverbs, there is a little bit of a changeover. In chapter 30, there is the words of Agur. And we're not sure who he was, probably one of the people who was connected with Solomon's inner circle. But you find that a lot of his writings were pretty basic and plain. Then the other one was King Lemuel. Anger, is one of the main things that's talked about, but Agur was one of the writers and Lemuel was one of the writers. And so they just add their contributions at the end. Solomon's job was to just try to put together a book of witticisms. And that is what he did. Of course, at the end, Lemuel talks about the honorable woman. It's one of the most read passages during funerals for women and also on Mother's Day. Now, the Song of Solomon is a totally different book, and I want to go to that. I talked about it Sunday. How many of you were here Sunday? You were. All right, so you know a little bit about this book. I've already shared it with you. It is a poem. It's not one of those poems that you're going to go like roses are red, violets are blue. That's not what we're talking about. It's a poem about a woman who is being, in some ways, what we would call victimized by her times. She was a pretty woman. She was a woman who was brown with her skin. She sounds like a young girl, but she is chosen for the harem. And there is no getting out of this. There are times when perhaps people would run away and get away that, but once you were marked, you were marked. Your family could suffer if you got away. So there's this girl, and she's picked, and this is what happens in chapter 1. She says, "Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth. Your love is better than wine." Then the harem says, "We exult and rejoice in you. We'll extol your love more than wine." And she begins to talk about herself. This is one of the characteristics of the woman, is she's very self-absorbed at first. Now, I think you will find this to be true if you trust me. When you read the book, you will find Solomon is not so self-absorbed. He is not talking about himself. Solomon is focused on her. She is focused on her. But this is the way it often is with young girls. Young girls can't help but live in front of the mirror. They're very insecure about their outer appearance. Solomon keeps just looking at her and telling her how beautiful she is. He doesn't talk about how beautiful he is because he doesn't have to. He's not trying to win her over, but she's very insecure. So you'll find the harem helping her. In verse number 5, "I'm dark but lovely." She says, "Don't look at me because I'm dark." Anyway, Solomon and his bride have a little brief conversation. "If you do not know, I compare you, my love, to a mare among Pharaoh's chariots. And the others in the harem, we will make ornaments of gold for you." They're trying to convince her to stay. So it's a back and forth conversation. Now, in this other part of the book of Solomon, she has these flashbacks to probably a boyfriend that she had who was a shepherd boy that was in her life in some points. And she has a dream about him coming back to him. And so she's dreaming and thinking about him in chapter 3, for example. "On my bed by night I sought him whom my soul loves," talking about this boy. And she cries out to the harem, says, "I adjure you, daughters of Jerusalem, do not wake up, stir up love till it pleases." In other words, give me time. And then Solomon comes, and he's ready to get married. And this girl is trying to get ready to be married, and she's got doubt about her and him. But they move forward, and then they are in the marriage, and then they move through the book, and they begin to interact, and the harem begins to celebrate, and there's a lot of dancing. And so you really read through this, and it's the story of like a person who just accepts what we would call the inevitable. She's not going to go back to the shepherd boy. The shepherd boy is going to go on. I don't know if y'all noticed, but there is a story that you just read recently about one of David's wives. Did you remember the wife that David had who was the daughter of Saul? And that after Goliath had been defeated, that her name was Michal, Michal, she had this really bad argument, and Michael said, I'm not going to have anything else to do with you or whatever. And anyway, she got hauled off by somebody else, took her. And then after years, David went back and got her and took her away from him, brought her back, left the guy crying. Do y'all remember that story? It was a sad situation, but it's like, you can't have my wife. I don't think he gave a lot of interest in what Michael felt about it. It wasn't about her, it was about him.
Yeah,
So
I kind of wondered why he waited so long.
yeah, I know, he did, didn't he? But yeah, he brought her back. So these, I tell you, these were tough times. It wasn't like it was now. It was, a man would go get what he wanted. And if it was a woman, he would go get the woman. I saw yesterday, or day before yesterday, on the news about the man who went into Pakistan, bought a 6-year-old girl from a family. Did you all see that? 50-some-year-old man buying a 6-year-old girl for his wife. So, isn't that just horrible?
It is.
So, yeah, the family was just so poor they couldn't afford to eat, so that was their way of saving their family. I can see that kind of thing. Yeah, pretty. So, you know, so this is the story of a girl who got hauled away, and part of her being hauled away was just because she was just, in the eyes of Solomon, someone to be had. So we move this section and we move into what really is the last part of the book of the Old Testament, and that's the story of the prophets. And you're going to like this because we're going to get a quick overview of the books of the prophets. We have what we call the major prophets. There are two different divisions, the major and the minor. And the major prophets are not major because they're more important, they're major because they're bigger. So they're Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. Now, we'll talk about these just a little bit. Isaiah was a brilliant prophet. And without any exception, he was the greatest of the prophets. The greatest in the sense that he had a better word choice, better vocabulary. He had a longer ministry. He had more influence. He had a powerful, persuasive personality. He had a lot of insight into Jesus coming. So Isaiah is an extraordinary book, but he lived during the time of the Assyrian rebellion. Now this means that he lived before Jeremiah, who lived during the Babylonian rebellion. So there was 120 years roughly between Isaiah and Jeremiah. Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and Daniel all lived along the same time. They lived during the Babylonian captivity. Now that doesn't mean that all that they write about is about the struggling that went on with the Babylonian captivity, but it was certainly a big part of their book that they wrote about. Now you have to recall that the people in both of these times, in Isaiah's time and in Babylon's time, they didn't want to surrender. It was, they didn't want to give up. None of them were ready to throw in the towel because they didn't want these people to come in and just take over. But the prophets, by and large, said, no, this is a part of God's plan because you didn't listen to them. They're going to take you. They're going to win. You may as well give up. Well, because of their message of surrender, They were hated. Jeremiah was particularly hated. They were hated because his message was unpopular. They took him and did a lot of things to him. Isaiah prophesied about Assyria, but he also prophesied beginning in chapter 40. Everything in chapter 40 is about Babylon. So he was telling stuff about Babylon before Babylon was even on the scene. He also wrote about, and this is very interesting, so if you put the order of the nations and who came to power, it would have been like this. Assyria rose first, then after Assyria rose Babylon, and then after the Babylon rose the Medes and Persians, which the Persians would be Iran. So this would be Iraq. So there you go. And so the Babylons, the Medes, and the Persians, and then after that the Greeks. Then after that the Romans. We'll change that to Seleucids. And then the Romans. And then that takes us to the time of Jesus, okay? So all of these things took place over 600 years or whatever, but these were the different ones who were coming to power. So a lot of the teaching from these prophets, you can tell if they're talking about Assyria, the capital of Assyria was Nineveh. You'll find people like Nahum talking about that. You'll find people like Hosea talking about that. You'll find people like Joel talking about that. So that's how you can begin to figure out who is where in the timing, because it's not always easy. The other way that you can read, when you read about the minor prophets and the other prophets, is it will usually tell you, they would say during the kings of, and then they'll put like Manasseh, or they'll put Hezekiah or whatever. So if you can face or find the king, it kind of helps you to place the time of the book. Now, I want to talk about the books that are hard to read. All four of these books are kind of hard to read. Daniel is the easiest to read to some degree, simply because it is a good story for the first 5 chapters. So Daniel 1 through 5 is the story that has a kind of a historical narrative. But then when Daniel starts getting off into some of these things of prophecy, where he's talking about these dreams and these animals and these kingdoms, and it gets to be a little bit hard to follow. But Daniel is easy to read, and it's really a book about prophecy more than anything. What makes Jeremiah hard to read is this: it is not in chronological order. So when you read it, you may find a sermon that he preached, and the sermon that he preached that's in chapter 2 was actually a sermon that he preached that would have been, if it had been put in order, it would have been better to have put at the end of his life. So you read Jeremiah different, and I hope you all will listen to me. You have to read Jeremiah and try to not worry so much about figuring out the historical, but try to think of it as a sermon and what he was trying to accomplish in a very difficult time. Jeremiah's ministry was very hard. He had the poor people left. He had the ones who were whipped, the ones who were hungry, the ones who were totally defeated. He had the ones who did not want him to live. They hated him. He was their pastor, and he stayed behind, and he starved with them. But whenever he stood up to speak, they looked at him with disgust. You should have saved us. You could have done something. You should have prayed for us. And they blamed him a whole lot. You told us to surrender to these people, and they killed my baby. You know, that's your fault. You know, why is God doing this? Why is God punishing us? And Jeremiah told them why they were being punished. But once they knew, it didn't matter. Do you all know why they were being punished? Why were they being punished? Yes, you do. You know. Idolatry was one. The biggest reason was idolatry. But they also did not practice God's law. And so the biggest thing that happened was God said, you're going to obey my Sabbaths. You didn't practice my Sabbaths. And now you're going to give me my Sabbath days.
70 years.
70 years. So everybody take your Bible and go to the last chapter of 2 Chronicles.
So was Jeremiah in the southern kingdom, or was he in the northern
He
kingdom
was-
after they'd been?
He stayed in the southern
He
kingdom.
stayed in the southern.
He was there the whole time. Except he did go on an excursion once to the Euphrates River. And
So it's 36.
yep, last one. All right, let's see. Here we go. It says here, Jerusalem captured and burned. Therefore he brought up against them, this is verse 17. He brought up against them the king of the Chaldeans. Chaldeans are another name for Babylonians, who killed their young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary, and had no compassion on young man or virgin, old man or aged. He gave them all into his hand, and all the vessels of the house of God, great and small, and the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king and of his princes. All these he brought to Babylon. And they burned the house of God, and broke down the wall of Jerusalem, and burned all its palaces with fire, and destroyed all its precious vessels. He took into exile in Babylon those who had escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and to his sons until the establishment of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths. All the days that it lay desolate, it kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. So, just to kind of, you know how God had made things in the commandment in Leviticus chapter 23. He said every seventh day, and then he said every seventh year. Then there would be a jubilee after 7 sevens. You follow me? You remember that? There were these different things. This one right here, every seventh year they were to let the land rest, and they didn't do it. And they didn't do it for a period of 10 cycles. So from the
Is that
time
same-
that they had been
is
there,
that the same thing as years?
years, yep. So 10 cycles of 7 years, they had not done it. And God said, I've been noticing it. So what we're going to do is we're going to let the land do what you should have let it done to start with. It's not going to grow anything for 70 years. And so they stayed in captivity while the land did what it was supposed to do. Now, I don't know that this is something that if people think about this. I think about this. So, you know, I preached a sermon. There was a time I was a tougher, harder, meaner preacher than I am now. I don't know if y'all believe that, but I had a hard streak in me, you know. So I'd preach on tithing sometime. And I remember preaching a sermon called, Does God Get Your Tithe? And I still got that sermon around here somewhere. I haven't pulled it out in 25, 30 years, but I talked about how, you know, if something belongs to God and you don't give it to him, does he get it back? And so, you know, he says the tithe is mine. And I remember when I was a little boy, we had a pastor's wife. And this was now, I was a little boy. This woman's name was Mrs. Norval. And she used to say, yeah, you go ahead and don't give your tithe. Like God will get your tithe. He'll get it at the doctor's office is where he'll get it. Or he'll get it at the so-and-so's where. You ever had anybody talk like that? But, you know, when I was a little boy, I was impressionable. And I thought, wow, it means if you don't give it to God, you're going to wind up losing it somewhere else. And her principle was this thing about the captivity. So it stood out to me. So I started going through the Bible, and I was surprised at how many times that principle really did come to pass, that I would see. People would try to hold something from God that was his, and of course they would lose it. You know, they would not be able to keep it. They didn't give God the firstborn, or they didn't give God this, and they didn't give God glory, and so they lost. You know what I mean? It was just a number of things like that. So anyway, it just makes me think about it. Jeremiah was one of my favorite people because his ministry was the hardest, and he suffered the most. And once in Jeremiah chapter 13, for example, God told Jeremiah to put on a linen girdle. And when we think of a girdle, it's different from the girdle that they wore. They would wear something across their midsection that was a support, like a belt. And so typically it was a leather girdle. So tough because they were, you know, in tough environment. So when Jeremiah left with a dirty linen girdle, it was very obvious, and people laughed at him and so forth. But he took it all the way down to the Euphrates River, which was 200-300 miles. And he did what God told him to do, to wear it and to prophesy in it and to preach. And he would say to the people along the way, if you read it, he would say, you're like this dirty girl, you know, and God is going to set you aside. And sure enough, he got down to the Euphrates River, and he buried his linen girdle under a rock in the moist area of the Euphrates, which was a picture of God taking his people and taking them away from him for a period of time. After a number of years, God told Jeremiah to go back and get the girdle. Well, the girdle was rotted. The girdle had holes in it. The girdle was messed up, but Jeremiah put it back on him. And from that, he came back and he said, the Lord is going to take you back, but you're not going to be what you were. You're going to be so different. You're going to be changed. You know, you're going to be less than you were. You're going to be damaged. So he went through all of that with them, and he said, but what the Lord wants is the Lord wants you close to him. God wants you close to him. He wants you to be with him. He wants you to be connected to him. He cares about you. And so he had a compassionate heart. Good story about a God who was reaching out to people in a very beautiful way in Jeremiah 13. And he had that sensitive side to him, but boy, he was, they tried to take him out 2 or 3 times. That's why he wrote what he did. Now, Ezekiel, I think he was schizophrenic or something, seriously. He had some kind of, I don't know, he was just all over the place. ADD and seeing dreams and visions. one of the best things about Ezekiel is when you get to the first chapter, he had a vision of heaven, and it is an extraordinary vision of heaven. He tells about how he sees all of these things moving in certain synchronistic patterns of moving in and out like, you all are so young. I can talk to you about this, but do you remember Jackie Gleason's show by any chance? Okay, well then if you remember Jackie Gleason's show, you'll remember the June Carter dancers.
Yep.
Do you remember how they used to do the legs? They would show the shop's top and everything was synchronized and you would see them moving in and out and all. Well, in some ways, Ezekiel describes a pattern of movement of the angelic beings where everything is moving like in certain patterns and synchronicity in heaven. And of course, there's this glorious throne that's in the midst of it where God is seated, but there are these terrific creatures that are there, and all they're doing is declaring the glory of God and the holiness of God. And he begins to describe how that light is being refracted upon these different colors. And so what you see is you see all these beautiful lights that are just flashing around this throne as God is letting it be like lightnings and strobe lights and flashes of lights through these different prisms. And so all of this activity is going on, and Ezekiel is overwhelmed. And the way he describes it is almost like a boy who is trying to explain something that he's never seen before. So you know it was very real. It would be like me trying to describe something that I had never seen happen in a cave in another country. If there was some kind of animal I didn't know about, and then there was certain kind of stuff going on, I wouldn't know how to really describe it. So you find that with Ezekiel. After you get into that first part of Ezekiel's description of heaven, Ezekiel is in Babylon at this time. He's not in Jerusalem. He's already been taken away. And so what he begins to describe are some of the things that he's seeing in Babylon. And he has all of these different kinds of dreams about what God is doing to his people and God is doing in the people in Jerusalem. So he's looking back in his mind and he's looking around at the circumstances and he's seeing the future, trying to see the future. And so his is more of a back and forth, the past, the present, the future, the past, the present, and the future. He also is one who did not get a lot of attention. They didn't pay him much attention. Everybody was so sad that nobody wanted to listen during this time. They were like too beat down. So when Ezekiel preached, the Bible says in Ezekiel 33 that you are to them just like a beautiful instrument. People are amused at you, and you're a good speaker, and they listen to you, but you don't make any difference. They don't hear your words. They're not doing them. It's kind of like, what difference does it make? You just get up, and they say, yeah, good job. Let's go home and continue living like we used to live, and that's the way they did. So Ezekiel had a kind of a time too where people weren't paying attention. But there was one thing that had happened, and it wasn't Jeremiah or Ezekiel. It was, it wasn't, it was Isaiah. In chapter 46, he talked about a guy by the name of Cyrus. And one day, now this is to show you how everything works. So this was let's just say 120 to 100 or maybe 220 years earlier. So just kind of think back. 100 years ago, was to 2021, 120 years ago would have been the 1900s, the turn of the century. Maybe back to the end of the Civil War. That would have been about how long time. Somebody said something about a guy named Cyrus. Now, along comes these prophets, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. Jeremiah eventually begins to go in decline. Ezekiel begins to go in decline. Daniel is getting old, and he's reading Jeremiah. And he learns about the 70 years. And it gets him excited. So in Daniel 9 and in Daniel 11, there's a change because there's hope, because they're getting close to the end of their 70 years. And then Daniel also remembers Cyrus from what was read here. So Daniel knew these people's writings. And so here is where, when Cyrus is brought back up, the people who are moving on next, which are Ezra and Nehemiah, are actually coming into power or influence when Cyrus is made king. And that's their signal that it's time to go back and start doing the things that they want to do. Cyrus gives them great favor, and he lets the Jews have their way so they can go back home. Now, they don't all go in groves, but they begin to go back. There were 3 or 4 different teams that went back. What time is it? I won't keep you long. But you should know this. You should know that the teams that went back under Ezra. That would be the first one. Ezra led a group of them with a pastor by the name of Haggai. And they went for the temple. We got to get the temple built. So they got people, and by the way, it was really discouraging. Because what happened was, if you read the first chapter of Haggai, what you will read is that when the people got back and started settling down, what do you think happened first? What do you think was the first thing that happened when they got back? And they went back to build the temple, but what do you think was the first thing they did?
Well, they had no walls. I don't know if that had anything to do with it.
They built their own homes.
Oh,
So they got back and said, we need to build homes. So they put their houses first. So I want to take everybody turn to the book of Haggai. You're going to have to use your index probably. But just go ahead and find it. Haggai, here we go.
It's a little book.
Little book. All right, so everybody has found it. Okay, so in your Pew Bible, it's on page number 941. So in the 2nd year of Darius the king, in the 6th month, the 1st day of the month, the word of the Lord came by the hand of Haggai the prophet to Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, the governor of Judah, to Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest. Thus says the Lord, these people say the time has not yet come to build the house of the Lord. Then the word of the Lord came by the hand of Haggai the prophet. Is it time for you yourselves to dwell in your paneled houses while this house lies in ruins? Now therefore consider, or thus says the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. Now stop right here. So there was, Ezra had led them, Haggai was with them. They had a guy who was in place by the name of Zerubbabel, and he was the governor of the region. So they had some people back, and they had their high priest, whose name was Joshua. So now you've got the players, Ezra and Haggai, Joshua, Zerubbabel. These were the people who were responsible. But when they got there to do this job, they built their own houses, and now Haggai is fussing with them because this is what he says. Is it time for you to dwell in your paneled houses while this house lies in ruins? Now therefore consider thus the Lord, thus says the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. You have sown much and harvested little. You eat, but you never have enough. You drink, but you never have your fill. You clothe yourselves, but no one is warm. And he who warns wages does so to put them into a bag with holes. Now this is an important principle. So he says you're putting your money into a bag, and there's a hole in it. And you're wondering where all of your money's going through. And he's saying that you're losing your money because you're not putting your priorities right. You should put your money where you're supposed to, which is to go on and get this house of God fixed, and then you wouldn't be going through some of this trouble that you're going through. Now, do you remember a while ago when I was telling you that I wondered about whether God gets your money or not? This is another one of those cases. Whereas if they had been doing right, they would not have had that kind of a problem. That's what Haggai was saying to them. He was saying, you all aren't doing right. You're not putting the God first. Consider your ways, go up to the hills, bring your wood, build a house, and I may take pleasure in it. You looked for much, it came to little, you brought it home, I blew it away. Why? Because, declares the Lord of hosts, because of my house that lies in ruins, while each of you busies himself with his own house. Do you see that? That's pretty simple, don't you think? It's not hard to understand. Who were they putting first, God or themselves?
Themselves.
They were putting themselves first. And so Haggai gives them a hard time. So they get started back again, and then they start back rebuilding the temple. Now, the same thing happened a little bit later when Cyrus, according to the book of Nehemiah, tells them that they can come home and start rebuilding the walls. So next we're going to have Nehemiah, who is the same thing in one way as Ezra. Nehemiah comes down and he says, we've got to build the walls. And then they put people in different places. And the story of Nehemiah is the rebuilding of the walls. Now look, if you would, at the different prophets who were what we call the prophets during this time. They would have been Malachi. So everybody turn to the book of Malachi for a minute. That's just a few pages old. So he is giving them a hard time in chapter 3. And he says, I draw near for you, this is verse 5. I draw near to you for judgment. I will be a swift witness of sorcerers, adulterers, and so forth. I, the Lord, do not change. You are not consumed. From the days of your fathers, you've turned aside from my statutes. Return to me, and I will return to you, says the Lord of hosts. But you say, how will we return? Will a man rob God? Yet you are robbing me. You say, well, how have we robbed you? And you say, in your tithes and contributions. You are cursed with a curse because you're robbing me, the whole nation of you. Bring the full tithe into the storehouse, and there may be food in my house, and thereby put me to the test, and see if I will not open the windows of heaven for you, pour down a blessing. And here, verse 11, I will rebuke the devourer for you, so it will not destroy the fruits of your soil and your vine, your field. God says, I will protect your stuff if you put your money where you're supposed to. We've got to get these walls done. So then after this sermon by Malachi, they begin to rebuild the gates. They get the money, they rebuild the gates, and then they finish in Nehemiah chapter 8. They finish, and then Nehemiah gets Ezra to come in and to read the Bible, and they just stand there and read the Bible, and people just cry and weep and suffer because of all of the sins that they have committed, and they repent. It's an awesome, awesome scene. Nehemiah chapter 8 is one of the beautiful, beautiful pictures of a revival, if there ever was one. And it was because the people started with the good intent. They got tired. They grew discouraged. Then they had Malachi to come in and preach and to help them. So the preaching of the word came in. And then they got back on the task. And then once they got back on the task, God started blessing them again. They started the crops started being like they ought to be. And then they got down to a true revival. And they got back. They made it back. They came all the way from utter destruction. And it was the total annihilation. And now they're rebuilding. They're starting over again. It's an incredible story. And the story that they have for the next 300 years is one where they still have some problems. It's not in the Bible, because there was a bad guy named Antiochus Epiphanes who comes in and he causes a lot of problems. But that was when they instituted the Festival of the Lights, the Hanukkah, because they were able to keep the light going in the temple supernaturally with the amount of oil that they used. And then Jesus comes. And that's when the temple was being rebuilt under Herod. And it was, God is bringing them along. But this is a part of the history that took place right before before Jesus.
Nehemiah was a good leader too.
Was an excellent leader. That was one of the most incredible things about him. He was smart, sharp, focused.
I'm going to ask a question. When Isaiah, you said he prophesied before the Assyrians came in. So when he died, Bible says that Manasseh, he was like sawed in two.
Yes.
Well, Manasseh was almost at the end of the
Babylonians.
time. Yes, before the Babylonians came in.
Right.
So he actually died before the Babylonians came in, but the Assyrians had already come in.
Right. The Assyrians had already come in. Isaiah was alive when the Assyrians took over. Isaiah was alive when the Babylonians started coming under Manasseh. He ministered for 80 years.
Okay.
So his ministry lasted for 80 years. So he and Daniel had two of the longest prophecies of anybody in the Bible. Isaiah made it through as a young man, he made it through the Assyrians. 125 years later, there was the full Babylonian captivity. But I want to show you one thing though about that, okay? There were still 3 parts, okay? 614, 507, and 519. Okay, so these were all BC. So what we're doing is we're going down. So there were 3 phases to the Babylonian captivity. In the year 614, that's when they came in and they took Daniel. Okay, at 614. That's when they came in and they took Ezekiel. The first thing they did was they took out the best people. In 519, which was, that's not, it's got to be 570. 522. I know something's wrong. But anyway, years later, they came in and they took the other people. And then there was another third phase to it. And these dates may be wrong. I'm serious. 607 may be one of them. So anyway, I cannot recall. But anyway, 614 was the start. Isaiah would have died somewhere in here. He didn't live to see the terrible part of it, but he would have lived for about 100 years to have seen all that happened under Assyria that took them all the way to this part. So
But when the Assyrians came in, they actually took the people out and moved them and put people back in.
they
did
put
not?
their people back in.
Yes,
Yeah, and they forced them to intermarry,
yes.
which was a big thing, and they just separated them out. They became
Samaritans.
diminished by their intermarriages. And that's where a lot of them settled around Samaria, which is why they were so hated even in Jesus' time, where the Samaritan woman was.
Mhm.
All righty, we'll keep plugging along. We'll get this after a while.
Thank you.
All right, y'all. See you later.